On Christmas Eve, December 24th, 2002, Modesto, California looked like a postcard that had learned how to breathe. Quiet streets, soft porch lights, and that December illusion that every door leads to warmth. And that's exactly why this story still crawls under people's skin. Because nothing about the setting warns you. There's no storm siren, no shattered window, no cinematic scream. Just a neighborhood dressed for celebration, and a woman who vanishes so cleanly that the day itself feels contaminated afterward. Laci Peterson was 27 years old, 8 months pregnant, and by the end of that Christmas Eve, she was gone. This is a case where the facts are heavy enough on their own, so this will be told the responsible way, a clean timeline, clear distinctions, and no rumor theater. Because this story doesn't need exaggeration to feel terrifying. It begins the way many nightmares begin. Not with chaos, but with normal. Investigators later rebuilt the timeline the way you rebuild a shattered mirror, piece by piece, with cuts along the way, and no guarantee the reflection will ever be whole again. The night before, December 23rd, Laci went grocery shopping and had a prenatal appointment. Then she and Scott went to a salon where her sister worked, and he got his haircut. That night, Laci spoke by phone with her mother and confirmed dinner plans for Christmas Eve. It's the kind of normal that feels almost cruel in hindsight. Appointments, errands, a phone call, everyday life doing what everyday life does, right up until it stops. Then comes the morning of December 24th, and the case tightens into a narrow window of time that still makes people hold their breath. Scott Peterson later told police he last saw Laci that morning before leaving the home. He said they watched television, and he said she planned routine chores, mopping, baking, walking the dog, possibly going grocery shopping. Nothing about that list is dramatic. That's the problem. Because in missing person cases, the most terrifying moments are often the ones that don't announce themselves. They arrive disguised as routine. And then, like a cold finger pressing on the timeline, comes the dog. At 10:18 a.m., according to a court summary of the case, a neighbor, Karen Service, saw the Petersons' golden retriever, Mackenzie, wandering outside on the street, wearing his leash. Scott's truck was gone. Laci's car was still in the driveway. Service saw no signs of activity at the house, so she put the dog in the backyard and closed the gate. No forced entry, no obvious chaos, just a leash, a dog, and a street that looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. That detail is one of the reasons this case feels like holiday horror, even when you strip away every rumor, every theory, every dramatic retelling. Because in a story like this, a dog becomes more than a pet. It becomes a timestamp, a moving piece on a chessboard that proves something happened inside a narrow corridor of time, something that didn't need to shatter the neighborhood to change it forever. The leash matters because it suggests a normal action, letting the dog out, was either interrupted or used to create a picture of normal that wasn't real anymore. And when the world gives you only one moving piece, your mind starts turning it over and over. Like a key you can't stop twisting even after the lock refuses to open. By that afternoon, the house was being described in the most chilling way a home can be described. Not destroyed, not ransacked, just quiet. The record notes that family members tried to reach Laci without success. And later, Scott called Laci's mother to ask if she was there and said Laci was missing. Police inspected the home and found no signs of forced entry, nothing obviously taken, and Laci's purse was still there. That's the kind of scene that makes dread feel supernatural, because it doesn't offer your brain a clean explanation. It's not something happened. It's something happened without leaving the kind of mess we expect. The search began the way these searches always began. Hope first, terror later. Friends and relatives gathering, neighbors scanning sidewalks and parks, voices calling a name into the cold air. And because it was Christmas Eve, every detail seemed sharpened by the season. Holiday lights didn't feel cheerful. They felt indifferent. Store music didn't feel cozy. It felt wrong. The world kept celebrating, while one family began living inside a question. That's a special kind of fear. The fear of realizing the calendar will keep moving even if your life stops. Then the case took a turn that changed how millions of people interpreted everything they'd already seen. Investigators learned Scott Peterson had been having an affair with Amber Fry, and Fry later cooperated with law enforcement after learning he was married, including recorded conversations. It's important to say this carefully. An affair is not a murder weapon, and it doesn't automatically prove a crime. But in the public mind, and often in investigations, discovering a double life detonates trust. Suddenly, every earlier moment gets replayed with new suspicion, as if the past has been re-edited and the soundtrack has changed. From there, the timeline became a battleground. In cases without a single, clean eyewitness moment, investigators lean on what can be measured: travel times, receipts, patterns, and places that can be pinned to a map. Scott told police he decided to go fishing in the San Francisco Bay and drove to the Berkeley Marina, and a record notes a marina parking receipt indicating entry at 12:54 p.m. The marina became a focal point not because it was dramatic, but because it was concrete. One of the few places that didn't shift in a story full of uncertainty. And when you're hunting for truth, concrete matters because it's something the mind can stand on without sinking. As the weeks turned into months, the horror matured into something heavier, the slow terror of not knowing. Not knowing is not passive, it's an active force. It turns ordinary sounds into signals. It makes shadows feel like hiding places for answers. It turns a quiet house into an accusation. It's the psychological version of being followed, because you can't outrun a question that lives inside your own head. And then, in mid-April 2003, after a significant storm hit the Bay Area, the case changed shape. On April 13th, Connor's remains were found along the shoreline. The next morning, April 14th, Laci's remains were discovered at Point Isabel. The gap between those dates is only one day, but it marked the moment the story stopped being missing and became dead. After that, the question was no longer whether the story would end. It was how the legal system would try to explain an absence that had already devoured a family. The trial became one of the most watched in America, and in 2004, a jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. He was sentenced to death. Years later, in August 2020, the California Supreme Court upheld the convictions, but overturned the death sentence, citing significant errors in jury selection at the penalty phase. And because people compress years into one headline, here's the clean, factual update. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That matters because the public often confuses death sentence overturned with case overturned. Those are not the same thing. The convictions remained, the sentence changed. Even now, the story refuses to stay buried in the past. In January 2024, the Innocence Project clarified that the Los Angeles Innocence Project, an independent organization, took up Scott Peterson's case and filed motions seeking DNA testing and post-conviction discovery. In March 2024, reporting described Scott Peterson appearing via video in court as his attorneys pushed for DNA testing and access to evidence they argue could be relevant. And through 2025, outlets continued covering filings and arguments from his legal team and responses from prosecutors. None of that is a conclusion, it's a process. Filings are claims. Hearings are steps. Proof is something else. So why does this case still feel like Christmas horror to so many people? Because it attacks something deep in the adult brain. The belief that certain days are protected. Christmas Eve is supposed to be a boundary line. One last day of calm. One last day before the world gathers. In this story, that boundary fails. The day doesn't protect you. The neighborhood doesn't protect you. Even the rituals, walking the dog, confirming dinner plans, folding chores into a morning, become eerie when they stop mid-sentence. And perhaps the most haunting part is this. The scary element isn't a mask or a monster. It's the quiet professionalism of disappearance. The way a life can be erased between breakfast and afternoon while the rest of the world keeps its lights on. If you're telling this like a documentary, hold on to the discipline of facts, because the facts are heavy enough. A woman vanished on Christmas Eve in Modesto. A dog wandered home with a leash on. An investigation tightened around minutes, receipts, and places on a map. Remains were found in April along the shoreline. A conviction followed in 2004. A death sentence was overturned in 2020, while the convictions were upheld. A life without parole sentence followed in 2021. And legal motions continued into 2024 and 2025. That is the documented spine, and everything else hangs from it. Now picture that same street dressed for celebration. Porch lights glowing, windows warm, the world convinced it's safe. And then picture what this case proves. The line between ordinary and unthinkable can be thinner than a breath. One moment you're planning dinner, one moment you're folding chores into a morning, and the next, a silence moves in and takes a place at the table. Because for one family, Christmas Eve stopped being a holiday a long time ago. It became a date you don't celebrate, you survive. A timestamp carved into memory. A reminder that the world can look perfect, while something irreversible is happening behind a closed door. And that's why this story still doesn't feel finished when the screen goes black. Because somewhere in your mind, that leash is still dragging softly on the pavement, and the clock is still ticking.